Welcome to Small Talk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of Small Talk, I'm going to be joined once again by Rabbi Dovid Jaffee, who was just recently on Small Talk, where we were discussing a different type of sefer than we're discussing here. The previous one was on Lashon Hara, which was what can I say today about practical halachas of Lashon Hara. And this is something a little different now. We'll be discussing his new sefer in Hebrew on Chachmei HaMishnah. So it's a new sefer, Chachmei HaMishnah, and the subtitles told us Chachmei HaMishnah v'tukufeseim mishimon hatzadik ad Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi al pi Chazal rishonim v'achronim. And there's going to be there's a couple of specific Tanaim that are discussed here, as well as the Tkufa. So thank you, Rabbi Jaffee, for joining me once again.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here.
So this sefer is a little different than the other one, to say the least. We don't have to discuss, why one or the other, but what is the interest in this type of a sefer, and why did you decide to write this?
Okay, that's an important question. I'll tell you, over 10 years ago, when I decided to go into chinuch, I was talking to Rabbi Jaffee, who's one of the leading rabbanim here in Baltimore. And one piece of advice that he gave me is, he said, don't just teach the Gemara, don't just teach the Rashi. You have to teach the Talmidim who the personalities are that they're learning about. It's such a powerful way of deepening their appreciation and connection. That was the message that he gave me. And then a little while later, an opportunity came up to give a specific shiur on Jewish history. I was giving it for 11th graders in Eretz Yisrael here in Baltimore. And I decided to talk about the Tanaim. We're learning Mishnah, Gemara all day long. Why don't we deepen our appreciation of who we're learning about? And it became a very popular shiur, and then I ended up giving it in other contexts also. And that developed into a sefer.
Now, I think one thing we should emphasize right away, and you do emphasize this in the Hakdama of the sefer, which is this is not a history book in the classical sense. So, Sfarim Chatter, we have a lot of historians and professors who discuss a lot of history books. This is not a history book. Rather, it's a sefer. So, can you explain what exactly the sefer is and why we define it as not a history book per se?
This is something that's really trying to make a collection from Chazal, which will include Gemara's, Bavli, Yerushalmi, Tosefta, Midrashim, and put together a picture about the lives of the different Tanaim, some of the famous Tanaim of the Mishnah. And it continues after that with getting into Rishonim, Achronim, discussions, Toradic discussions. Of course, I use historical Sfarim also, Seder Adaros, Daras Rishonim, to help give the background for that. But the point is not a classic history sefer. It's really trying to take things from our Masara and building what we have in our Masara about these great personalities.
So when we talk about sources, usually something I discuss later in these episodes, but I think it's important to discuss it here. So you mentioned the sources, but when it comes to other sources like Yosifun or Josephus or other historians, I know you mentioned to me off-air, Dervish Shainim is one that you use, but let's call them historical sources. Are there any historical sources that you do use in the Sefer?
Well, as you mentioned, I occasionally will quote something from Josephus. It's usually what the Daras Rishonim brought, and various other historical sources, because I think that's important. History, what we find in those historical sources are important, but those have to be taken with a grain of salt. What we know, our absolute Masara, is what we have from Chazal. And when a historian's saying something, a lot of it is conjecture. And sometimes I'll even quote the source and then ask kashas on it. I'll say it doesn't fit into Chazal. It's interesting. There's even a Marsha in Maseches Tainus who discusses something from Josephus and asks the kasha, or Yosifon, he asks the kasha, how does that fit into the Gemara, which is interesting. He tries to make them both fit together. So it's something that I take into account, but that's not the primary focus of the Sefer. I use it to enhance the Sefer.
Let's start discussing some of the Sefer. And before we get to the Tanaim, something that you start the Sefer right away with is the Tkufas discussed. So you have the Tkufa of the Tanaim, the Beis HaMikdash, the Chachmei, Tzedukim, various other things going on at a time. So I think you should mention a little bit of that and what is discussed there before we get into a few specific Tanaim that are discussed in the Sefer.
Well, what I really begin the Sefer with is, since the Tanaim are really starting from Shimon HaTzadik and the Zugos are towards the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash, I have a arichos to understand what really the second Beis HaMikdash is about, how the second Beis HaMikdash is different than the first Beis HaMikdash. The first Beis HaMikdash is a period of Nevuah. The second Beis HaMikdash, we no longer have Nevuah, and there's a tremendous growth and focus on Torah Shebal Peh. And it's really on that background that we have this amount of Torah that we have from the Tanaim and Amoraim. So that's just an important introduction. And then as I go through the lives of the different Tanaim, that has to do with points in history. Like you mentioned, the Chachmei, which might have been in the times of Yossi ben Yoezer, when the Tzedukim arise. When I talk about Rabbi Akiva, I get into the Bar Kochba revolt. So, Derech Agav, as I discussed the Tanaim, I talk about the different things that were happening and affected their lives, which is also important for us to understand the Tanaim themselves.
So you have a whole chapter on Tekufas Bayis Sheni. Let's talk about some of the Tanaim that you have here. You have a chapter on Shimon HaTzadik. You have a chapter on Antigonus. You have a chapter on Shimon ben Shetach, and you call it V'Seif Chashmonaim. There is one of the parakim is Hillel Habavli v'Raboisav, Perek Zayin, that is Beis Hillel Beishamai. You have Perek Cheses and Siyam Mizarei Shel Hillel. You have a Perek on Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenes, Rabbi Yeshua Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and then you have on Rav as well. I guess Rav is, Tanaim Amoraim. Okay, so let's, you put Rav in there. Okay, so we're not going to go through all of them and sit and go through specifically, but if you want to pick one or two as an example to highlight, like how do you go through the live or discussion of one of the Tanaim, if you want to pick one?
Okay, well, I'll just mention more in a general sense. Each parak is something different. I really found what I saw in Chazal, Rishonim, Achronim, Chasidish Sfarim, sometimes Mekubalim, and tried to present something. So, Lamashal, with Rabbi Akiva, a big focus on what I talked about Rabbi Akiva is drawing a connection throughout Shas, how we see Rabbi Akiva in so many circumstances is always able to see the Tzad HaTov. When everyone else sees tragedy, there's some famous Gemaras about that, Rabbi Akiva is always able to see the Tzad HaTov. And I have maybe 10 different places where we see that running theme. So for Rabbi Akiva, I was focusing on that running theme. We could talk about Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. I have a discussion there. We know that Beis Hillel are usually Mekel, Beis Shammai are Machmer. What's the reason behind that? I bring a Zohar Kadosh to discuss this, that it has to do with the Shorish Neshama that they have and their whole approach in Avodas Hashem. I get into an interesting discussion by many of us might have heard that La'asid Lava, we're going to pass them like Beis Shammai. Where does that come from? The halacha is going to be like Beis Shammai. What's the source of that? What would be the reason behind that? And so for each different Tana and Amara, there I found the different fascinating sources that we have in our Masara and had discussions about those.
For example, also so let's say Shimon HaTzadik. So you start off with Kufas V'Yichus. So you start off with the Masechta Avos, in the beginning in the second parak that everyone knows, Shimon HaTzadik, Misharik and Esagdela, etc. And then you bring in what Misharik and Esagdela means. So you break down what Shiari means, and you quote the Rambam and so on. And then that's Kufas, and you'll bring some other Mefarshim to break it down. Then you'll talk about Maisav. And we'll talk about the famous Maisim and Shimon HaTzadik and Alexander the Great, and that's one part that you'll have. And then again, so just trying to give like a listener like the different anafim, as you call them, basically the little sub chapters in the chapter itself in the parak that you're breaking down and you're going through. And so it's a lot of quotes also from the different chazals, also with you talking and explaining as well. Correct?
Right. I want to bring sources. I want the reader to be able to see primary sources. This is the Masar that we have from Chazal and the Gedolei Yisrael about it, and then I help develop the themes that we find in those Chazal.
How did you go about finding these Chazal when you were discussing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of it is something that I know. I've looked at various different Svarim, there's so many excellent Svarim on this. I've used some of Rabbi Miller's Svarim. Doris Rishonim did a tremendous job. Tolos Tanaim V'Amoraim. The list goes on and on. There's so many different Svarim that talk about it. And I'll tell you the truth. Originally, the way the Sefer started, it was really the Mar Makomos I gave to the Bachram when I gave the Shir. And it developed. I gave the Shir for numerous years, and each year I'd find something new. Bachram would ask Kashas. They would show me a Mar Makom. I'd look into something. And this has been a work in progress for many years. And as I'm learning through different sugyas and shas and looking at different svarim, I say, oh, wow, this is something that relates to Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenes. Let me add that in. So it's been a long process, and I think that adds to the richness of the Sefer, that it's been taking so many years to make this. I've been able to add, over the years, so many different Mar Makomos. You really have hundreds of different svarim that I use throughout the Sefer.
How do you pick which Tanoim to focus on, or to give their own chapter?
Okay, that's a really good question. I started going through, as you mentioned, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. So I wanted to start with Shimon HaTzadik, who was really the earliest person that we have in the Mishnayos. And then I traveled down through the Zugos until we got to Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai, who are at the end of the Zugos. And then for the most part, I followed the primary Talmidim of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, getting to Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch were the greatest Talmidim. And then some of the most famous Tanaim, like Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. The truth is, I wish I had been able to get to more, But as the Doros go on, there's so much more literature and Chazal about them, and it just got too expansive for the Sefer. Maybe there'll be another opportunity in the future to have a part two.
With this Sefer, I mean, there have been other Svarim in Hebrew and English that do similar type of things. What would you say is unique about this Sefer?
I would say what's unique about it is that it's not just history. There's a lot of hashkafa that's involved in the Sefer. Some of it I mentioned before. And there's tshuva svarim that I'll quote if there's an interesting halachic discussion that comes up. Hillel was supported by his brother Chachmei, and does a person lose his schar if they're being supported by learning Torah? Different halachic discussions, yisodos in hashkafa, and it's like a very rich discussion. It's not pure history. There's a tremendous amount of Torah that's there, tremendous amount of yisodos in Chasidus and hashkafa, and people who have looked at the Sefer have really appreciated the depth and breadth that exists in the Sefer. So it's a Sefer. It's not a history book, as we talked about at the beginning.
Right. To give one example, which is I did a series on this last year, you talk about the Zayir. So you get the Shem Beichai and you talk about the Zayir. So the first thing is you bring the Tikkunei Zayir, which talk about how Rashbi wrote the Zayir, and then you discuss. Say variyesh arichas gedayla ben achronim beinian had bezayir kadosh mesina shemesh lamarayim shachayir akre tekufas Rashbi, right? How there's names of Amarayim that are in there that after Rashbi.
Yeah.
So if yesh let's say bekitzers names, you bring bekitzers, you quote Chaim Vital, the Shem Ramunim, the Mikdash Melech, then you bring Rabbi Yaakov Emden's comments in Matbachas Forum, and when it comes to Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who was part of the discussion when I did the series, you quote that. You also bring you quote on the bottom of the Chassam Sofer that talks about it. So you go through that. Then you start talking Bechlal about the Zayir, and then you're quoting a wine travel. So you're really having a whole interesting kind of collection of all different shit. Like you're saying, it's not just focused on that. You're obviously going on. Obviously, that's one thing with the Zayir with Rashbi, but you're quoting other things besides Hashem Beichai. So just to give listeners kind of a flavor, and also, as we said before, you're really quoting in block quote throughout a lot of these sources. So you're not only do you say where the source is, you're actually quoting it, and there are also footnotes. Like what goes in the footnotes generally?
Okay, if something's not going to flow so well in the text, I don't want the reader to get caught up with that. So it's going to be something that's like more of an Ian discussion, or something that's going to be a more technical discussion, or sometimes it'll just be derech agav. It won't be the main focus. So yeah, there's a lot in the footnotes as well. It's a really rich sefer I put tremendous amount of work into it to bring yediyas. I think a person who learns the sefer, they're going to see so many yediyas from our Masara, about the Tanaim Damarim, about things that were happening that they wouldn't have known otherwise. It's just, people have told me that have seen it already, that it's a rewarding experience going through the Sefer.
Right, I'll throw something else. Like you talk about Rameir, so the fourth anaf is Gudolas HaBatayra. So you say Rameir Amkin Godel, and you bring the Gemara in Sanhedrin, and then you follow up with the Gemara in Erevin. I'm not reading the quotes, but there's Gemara in Erevin. V'aydi Yisab Erevin Sham, and you read another quote, and then you start saying, Bir Marsha, and then you go back to Maslik Gemara's Messiah, then you bring a Teres Chaim, then you start quoting the Yerushalmi. So it's going back and forth with the different Gemaras all over the place, Bavli Yerushalmi, and with the Mefarshim, explaining this part of Rameir as an Amkin. So that's not a historical thing at all. That's more of a Torah aspect of explaining Rameir. So that's important to emphasize and to explain what he did. Okay.
Right, I try to make sure not to get caught up in too many technicalities. I'm bringing out Yisodos, and I'm trying to make it something that's geschmack and enjoyable for the reader, but everything is sourced. Sometimes they're in history books, you just see it as if it's a halacha Moshe Messina. This is how it happened. And I want everyone to know what's really part of our chazal, and if something's from an outside source, okay, let's see that source and examine that source.
I think that's a good point that you make, that it's a very free-flowing sefer, and it's a sefer. Someone wants to pick it up and read it and just read about the Tanaim. You can really read it. It's very easy to read, and it's not something. Sometimes you have these problems. They're overly technical, especially with something like this. They're trying to work through different sources, different girsas. That's not what the sefer is. It's meant to be enjoyable, pleasurable read that you can really work through, see the Tanaim through Chazal's eyes, so to speak. Yeah. Okay, so who would you say the sefer is meant for?
That's a good question. I would say it's meant for anyone who obviously has a basic Gemara background. It's a Hebrew sefer. You have to be able to read Hebrew and understand Hebrew. But I was trying to make it within that context of someone who has that basic background, Shavah L'chol Nefesh. It's something that tries not to get too much into technicalities. And it's, as I said before, bringing out Yisodos in Chasidus, Yisodos in Hashkafa. And it's something that a person, I really think, like I started at the beginning, as Rav Hapfer told me, it's for anyone who learns Gemara and wants to enrich their understanding, appreciation, and relationship with these great people. It's a sefer for them to learn.
So you probably answered this already, but I'll ask it anyways. What are you trying to accomplish with this sefer?
Yeah, so it's basically along the same lines. I'm trying to grade in people's appreciation for learning. And people who have gone to the shiur and people who have looked at the sefer have really benefited from that because it brings it alive. We just see names and we don't have an appreciation of who the person is. Once it's a real person that we can not relate to, they're obviously on a much higher madrega than us, but we know about them. We know some of their shitas. We know about their life. It brings to life our whole experience in learning Gemara.
And you mentioned your shiurim. Are those shiurim, like I said, you just give it to Bachrim, or those are recorded shiurim?
I have some of them recorded. I've given to various different forums, but some of them are available.
So the sefer was turning into your notes, I guess, your shiurim into a sefer.
Exactly. Right, over the course of many years.
Okay, and the sefer is published by Ali Zeiss. I'll link to it in the show notes. It's available in Sfarim Stores for those interested in purchasing it as well. It's a pretty big sefer as well. We didn't mention it's 420 pages, so it's a real big chibur. It's not just a small, little, thin sefer, which is important to note. So now you wrote something on Lashon Hara in English, and now you're writing a sefer on the Chachmei Mishnah. What's next? Something totally different as well?
Yeah, Baruch Hashem, I have a lot of interests. So I have a series that I'm working on Navi, Sefer Yefei 9, that I already put out on Yoshua and Shoftim a year or two ago, and now I'm working on publishing the next one on Shmuel, which is also a likut. This is a likut of trying to bring Yesodus on Navi. So bringing out fundamental concepts is something that's really important to me. The Rambam has a line that he says, learning a Yesod in Emunah is one of the most chavav things to him. So it's another sefer trying to bring out Yesodus in our Masara and Yesodus in Emunah.
Okay. So for those interested, again, you can find the Swarm Store. You can find the link in the show notes to purchase it. And thank you, Rabbi Jaffee, for joining me once again.
Okay, it was a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.